Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we have 10 true scary stories from abandoned places for your listening pleasure. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Click the bell to be notified of daily content and follow me on Twitter. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlight and let the darkness take control. I'm from a city in Australia called Adelaide, and a pretty smallish population of about 1 million compared to the rest of the country. My friends and I for the past year have been pretty heavily involved in draining and urban exploring, water drains, abandoned buildings, etc. But due to our city's small population, there are a pretty limited amount of locations to find. So my friends and I were pretty ecstatic to find a new location being passed around by the Urbex community, known simply as Heaven's Gate, an abandoned retirement and brain injury ward that was scheduled to be demolished but had been down for a good 5 years. Now, usually when a building is abandoned here, it gets pretty tightly locked up, boarded windows, padlocks, etc. But whenever an abandoned building gets scheduled to be demolished, they unlock everything, for workers and construction site managers, I presume. Anyway, my friends and I traveled to this location, which is pretty well hidden behind a lot of vegetation and a large iron fence, but still located next to a main road with houses adjacent to the complex. We jump the fence and go about our exploration, taking photos and just messing around like teenagers do. The majority of the building had been trashed, and we found a few sleeping bags and hundreds of empty spray cans. I'm guessing the majority of the residents were Italian and Greek, as there were a lot of Greek and Italian books and posters and VHSs littered in the rooms. My friends and I explore the complex without any problem and leave within an hour of being there. The problem is my friend moved too fast through the place, so a lot of my pictures I took on my Nikon were either too blurry or too dark, and I really wanted to get a few good shots before it got demolished. So the same night I went back at around 9 to 9:30, taking photos throughout the building. I followed the main hallway as you go through the back side of the building, intended for nurses. You can get lost easily. So the building is a pretty dark place, but I brought a pretty powerful hand torch, and my Nikon has a flash, so I can see pretty well. I make my way through the hallway and pass through a set of hospital doors. These doors were being held open by chairs that you just had to climb over. Now, this section of the ward was the brain injury or mental ward for patients with disabilities. The doors were electronic, but since the power was off, I think someone managed to open them with a crowbar and then leave them open like that. This was to make sure that patients wouldn't accidentally walk out. As I make my approach through the metal ward, taking photos, I suddenly hear a loud bang, almost like shelves or a book slamming, almost making me crap my pants. I stick my head out the room, the one I was currently in, I think it was like a TV or recreational area, and look down the hallway to see that one of the chairs had been pushed out the way, and the door closed. To this day, I have no clue how or what would have moved the chairs, as it was filled with sand to prevent patients from throwing them or using them as weapons. It takes at least 2 to 3 people to lift them. Anyway, the doors are shut, and I run over to see if I can open them, and I try and push and nothing works. So I start spamming the button like crazy, but obviously the power's off, so that doesn't work either. I'm not sure how the door actually works, but it had a massive black bar across the top, which I assumed was like a powerful magnet or something that can be turned on or off, and the default is just on. Anyway, with my failed attempts in opening the door, I try to press forward to see if I can find another exit. I finally find the second exit, but the double doors are closed as well with the exact same system. At this point I'm kind of freaking out, because I'm not only trapped, my phone was flat, and I swore those doors were open when I came to visit with my friends. It was about 10:30, and my parents go to sleep pretty early because they both have work, and I'm usually always out with friends this late, so me missing wouldn't be out of the ordinary. I was kind of pooing myself at this point because no one knew I was there and I couldn't get out. I tried walking along the walls to see if I could find a window I could smash through, but there was nothing. I started getting really frustrated, so I start throwing these pieces of tiles on the ground at the door harder and harder, not really trying to open it, just dealing with the stress of the situation, I suppose. Then I hear the noise of crunching tiles and I freeze. I hold my breath and just listen. It was definitely footsteps. I convinced myself to call out, so I did. "Yo, help, I'm trapped." As soon as the footsteps stop, I hear the laughter of an old woman, or a heavy smoker, from the other side of the doors. The laughter turned into running away, and the crunching of tiles disappeared as they became more distant. This, at first, made me think it was a tagger, or kids, but the laugh of an old woman didn't make any sense. No one sounding that old could run that fast. Eventually my torch went out and I was in absolute pitch darkness. Out of memory, I managed to find a bathroom with a door which is just closed and locked. I stayed in the bathtub and pray something would come. Spoilers, they didn't. Now I don't know if you get this, but if you're staring at the dark too long, you start to see shapes and even figures. Now imagine being alone in an abandoned mental ward, trapped and without light. You can kind of see how this would freak you out. I ended up staying the night until sunrise, which was about 6 a.m. Obviously I did not just sleep, but I walked out into the hallways to have another crack at opening the doors. Just FYI, I didn't know it was sunrise all the time, as everything was flat. I walked around and, to my luck, I found an old window that I'd missed before. It had been spray painted black, and only small dots of light shined through. So I picked up an object and threw it at the window and ran as far away as possible. I've been back there a few times, but I never told my friends about me going alone, as I feel like they'd have gotten pissed that I went back without them, and also I got stuck. The house I was born in and grew up in was built in 1912, and at least one person had died there. There was a crawl space that went from the back of my closet, where there was a hole about 3 by 3 feet, maybe 4, just enough to literally crawl through, that went to the back of 2 closets in the master bedroom. Those entrances had actual panels that went to the crawl space. We never went in there, partially because there was no need, and mostly because I was a kid and it scared the crap out of me. When in my teenage years we were redoing the insulation in our attic. The only entrance to the attic at the time was a tiny square panel in the ceiling of one of the upstairs rooms. We were also going to build one of those pull-down ladder things during this project. The attic always scared the hell out of me, because sometime when we were kids we would wake up and the panel would be slightly shifted and pushed in, but not fully covering the hole, but we figured it was our dad messing with us. Anyway, the attic was unfinished, so we're laying on boards on the crossbeams, since you could hypothetically fall through the attic if you stepped poorly. I noticed that the attic goes back way further than I thought. I keep going with this terrible flashlight and see it actually drops down at one point to an area to the first floor. Then I see that it's connected to the goddamn crawl space, which is kind of weird, but whatever. I keep going and it drops down to this large area I would later realize is the roof of our porch. It was like a tiny room, but the floor was sketchy like the rest. There was a creepy wooden children's chair standing up in this room. There was also a board/piece of wood about a ½ inch thick in the room, the area of a rectangular sheet of paper. There were names carved into the board, one in each corner, top, bottom, left, right. The one in the middle and 2 randomly in between. The weird part is that the one in the middle was carved deeper than any of the others, then gone over in some kind of red ink. The weird part was that the name was scratched up like someone had gone at it with a knife in anger. The weirdest part is that it was my name, and my name has a semi-unique spelling, but I wouldn't say it's extremely uncommon. I've met a couple of people who spelt my name the way they spelt it, but still it was very weird. I didn't really think about it at the time. We redid the roof of the porch shortly after and pulled the chair and boards out. At the time I just dropped it and got the hell out of there. Last time I shared this story, people said a picture would have been great. I did get curious and thought I might have stashed it in the basement or something, but I asked my brother as he still lives in the house, and he says that we tossed it with the rest of the stuff we found there years ago. It just started out like all our other urban exploration trips did. My reckless self and equally reckless friend had to make the long 40-plus minute drive, reaching our destination a little past 2. Fort Worth, Texas, home to the Main Street silos. After sizing up the impressive dilapidated structures that we sought to explore, we exited the car and set out on the short walk to the silos. The path required us to cross 3 sets of railroad tracks, surrounded by an overgrowth of wild grass and plants. It didn't look difficult, but the most treacherous obstacles were the small ditches between every track, filled with water, along with scattered debris and rocks. As we got closer, eyeing the easiest route through the tracks, a voice called out to us from below an overpass. "Hey." Instantly we both recoiled back, as this had been our first encounter with another person on one of our trips. We both looked at each other in disbelief until the voice called out again. "Oh, I'm sorry, didn't mean to scare you." Relieved, we realized the voice belonged to a homeless lady, taking refuge on a mattress nearby. My buddy casually called out and explained that we were just exploring, and that was it. We continued. Crossing the tracks slowly and carefully, we came to the site that we had long awaited. As per usual, the 2 of us began to investigate our surroundings, looking for any entrance or points of interest. This went on for some time until we found an open window in Silo 1 that led to a room within. In that room, there wasn't much to see except for a rusty ladder attached to the wall. The only way was to go up, however reckless we might be. We decided it wasn't worth the risk without investigating the rest of the site. Exiting the same way we came in, we resumed our path and decided to explore Silos 2 and 3. We didn't find anything of interest or any way in, so we figured the ladder might be our best bet. As we were looping back around towards Silo 1, my heart dropped. I grabbed the arm of my friend and pointed him towards the way we had just came from. 2 flashlights were bobbing up and down at the other end of the silos. "Lights out," my friend whispered to me. Neither of us wanted to risk being seen by these individuals. We looked at each other, frantically exchanging guesses as to who these people might be. Cops? Homeless? Other explorers? Our eyes glued to the unexpected visitors, and it quickly became clear that they were making their way over to us in a rather swift manner. We continued to creep back, but the lights kept advancing. Only they were gaining pace, so my partner looked at me, somehow shouting and whispering at the same time, "Run!" We sprinted for the railroads, practically hurtling over the ditches that we had so carefully crossed beforehand. Looking back, the lights had made their way to where we were when we initially spotted them. We lowered ourselves between the ditches to hide from the unknown, and after what seemed like hours, we peeked our heads to see if they were still there. But there was nothing. Whatever. They had gone, and weren't there anymore, and their lights were out. It was as if they disappeared into thin air. Collecting ourselves, we made the joint decision to try to flank them. The 2 of us made our way to the far side of Silo 3. It was here that we noted the overpass had a sidewalk that started there and could be used as a safe route back to the car. Next to the sidewalk, we stumbled upon what could have been the old office building the silo used. It was abandoned and no longer in use, but that didn't interest us. We silently examined a chain-link fence connecting to the building and Silo 3. There was an open gate in the fence that would lead us behind where the lights had been. Taking a deep breath, we passed through the gate and completed our flank of the individual. There was still nothing to be found. It was just us and dead silence hanging in the air. Despite our nerves, we resumed our mission and continued to explore as normal. We cleared the whole area and looped back to the left side of Silo 2. Moments later, my partner noted a cryptic 3-foot opening in Silo 2. We took the liberty to turn our flashlights back on and investigate the strange opening. It was then that my partner had alerted me of a door ajar within the opening. With our backs against the wall, we made the most nerve-wracking and off-putting entry in our history of urban exploration. The door only led to a claustrophobic room that someone had once called home, and we noted blankets and water bottles scattered around. There wasn't much else to see, so my partner and I turned back around to leave the room. When both of us looked at each other, there was a crunch. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friend. My ears weren't deceiving me. We both heard the same thing, and it was very close. It was a footstep. Whoever the hell that was still nearby, and they knew we were here. Immediately we killed our lights and listened, but there was nothing. An eternity had passed, with nothing but dead silence filling our ears. Finally, we decided to exit the room and see if anyone was outside. I peeked my head out from the door and looked both left and right. I saw nothing. It was then that I began to slowly exit the room and head back in between Silo 1 and 2. I motioned for my friend that it was safe, and we began making our way out to the end of the silos to continue exploring, trying to get away from that area. Then suddenly, headlights illuminated the wall of an old office building near the end of one of the silos. Red beams of light danced across the wall of our surroundings. Panicking, we both dropped into the brush and crawled to the side of the silo to avoid being seen. It was just a work truck passing right in front of us, moving towards the work site behind the silos. After the truck had left, my friend and I both decided that we had had quite enough and headed towards the railroads. As we were about to leave the area, my friend suggested that we get a few pictures before departing. So we went back between the path and took a few pictures. The last of the pictures we wanted was selfie style in front of the barred off entry points. While trying to get the right angles, we heard a strange noise that almost seemed to come from inside the room behind us. Having had our fair share of terrifying experiences that night, we decided it was time to pack up and head out, making our way back to the railroads. That's when we heard a roar in the distance. It couldn't be. It was chugging along the tracks closest to the car. An actual train. The train passing by meant that our safest path back to the car would be blocked off by thousands of tons of steel speeding by it. My partner wasn't fazed and told me to continue heading towards the train, as it would simply pass by and then we could get across it to safety. It was only when we got closer that we heard the screech. There's absolutely no way. This train wasn't going anywhere. In fact, it had stopped right there and then, dividing the line between us and the car. Almost instantly, another train came and was braking on the tracks closest to us. Not wanting to take our chances with the truck we saw working near the overpass sidewalk, we decided that, however stupid it might be, when the second train stopped, we would hop over and in between the carts to book it to the car. Patiently camping alongside the tracks, we waited to hurl ourselves into the closest cart and readily make our escape. This would have worked if our luck wasn't so terrible that night. Another roar emerged from the distance. A third train made its way along the middle track and began to brake. These were freight trains, so braking to a full stop was far from immediate. It was at this point my partner and I were in sheer panic. Waiting for this train to stop was a no-go. We were sitting ducks in an area where freeloaders and train hoppers ran rampant. We spotted another overpass in the distance and figured this would be our escape. It was the only way for us to go, and was away from the tracks, but not towards the silos. This next scene was something straight out of a movie. We had to stride through chest-high bushes and wild grasses to make our way to safety, running as fast as we could while battling off the vegetation. I yelled for my friend to hold up as the overgrowth managed to remove and swallow my shoe. After a frantic search, we found the shoe and continued our pace. At this point, we realized the impossible. To get to the end of this seemingly endless overpass, we had to cross yet another railroad, with another train coming. It seemed like there was literally no way out. We kept getting screwed from every direction, and after another moment's panic, I made the executive decision to head back to the silos. The pair of us darted alongside yet another set of tracks that ran through the train yard next to the silos, both of us being absolutely gassed from running. We slowed the pace and jogged back to the silos while collecting our sanity. This kept getting worse. A horn sounded from behind us in the distance, and the tracks we were following suddenly became illuminated in our horizon. They just kept coming. We had to outrun a train. Finding the last of our energy, we sprinted until we could hop off the tracks and return to the silos. Moments after, the train passed. The sinister place that was home to the dangerous and unknown had now become our safe haven. We had literally nowhere else to go other than back to the chain link fence and to the sidewalk of the overpass leading back down to the car. We had no choice but to risk running into someone. The two of us ventured over the fence. At this point, we were both satisfied with being alive and threw caution to the wind and made it to the overpass sidewalk safely, did a victory dance, and finally made our trek back to the car. Ah! The sound echoed across the wall of the silos. We had walked halfway across the overpass, admiring our surroundings and coming back to reality. We stopped in front of our tracks when we heard an ominous screech. It sounded like it was coming from inside a silo, a child screaming in agony. An identical screech resonated once again, but this time coming from the houses on the other side of the overpass. It was someone's rooster, cawing in the early morning. It was 4 a.m. Time to go home. I used to work for a company that specialized in hazmat, restoration, and working in confined spaces. We traveled around the country depending on the type of contracts we had. We dealt with some pretty cool and sometimes creepy stuff. One that comes to mind was a haunted Indian school. The story goes that it was run by Christians, and they had a tendency to lose Native American children. My boss had called me and a few others in so we could pick our crews and go over the plans. Most of us already had people in our crews that we liked, due to specific skills or because of their demeanor. This time we were instructed to pick guys who could keep cool at all times, since this job wouldn't really need anything special. It was going to be demolished by another crew after we went in. We got a warning about the building. The boss let us know that people broke into it all the time to do crazy witchcraft stuff, and to be careful of anyone who might reside in it, such as hobos, cultists, and, ghosts, because it was supposedly haunted as hell. At the site, our radios would go off and sometimes we'd hear someone talking. We thought it was just interference. Our harnesses would get tugged on and no one was there. And a few times I got to hear voices of people calling my name. I believe the place was haunted, and so did most of the guys. Several used to hold prayer circles before we went in, and a few refused to go in and were asked to be moved to different job sites, which we would do for their safety and ours. Quite a few things happened there, but nothing I can really call malicious. There were a few things that happened at the school that really did trip me out. One was when we had to do something called a pipe chase. Basically, I and another guy would follow a pipe for contaminants and remove them like lead, asbestos, or whatever. We were told that we had to remove some asbestos from several pipes that ran between the ceiling in what would be considered a crawl space. Usually these were a hassle because you have to keep your weight on I-beams and use boards in a very small area, but because we would do stuff like this often, it wasn't that much of a big deal. So while we were chasing this pipe, we ended up hitting a wall. The issue with that was that there wasn't supposed to be a wall there. Where the pipe met the wall, we could see that it led to an open area that had more contaminants. Our plans had shown that there was no wall. So I contacted my boss and asked him if it was okay for us to burst through. He gave the okay after making sure it wasn't weight bearing and there wasn't another access to there without having to break through it. We were through after about an hour or two, making a hole big enough for me and my co-worker. Immediately after we crawled through, we noticed that the pipe led to the corner of this area and down. Close to where the pipe went down was a square cutout, like if it had been a service entrance but didn't have a door or ladder. It was just a straight cut square in the concrete. But because we didn't want to crawl back to the rig to get a ladder, then wrestle said ladder into a confined space with another area that would require us to make the hole we made bigger. But because we didn't want to crawl back to get the rig, to get a ladder, then wrestle said ladder into a confined space into another area that would require us to make the hole we had bigger, to a spot that we weren't even sure had anything in it. I asked my co-worker to spot me up while I used a rope to climb down there and see if we even needed to work in there. This was a huge no-no, and it could have easily gotten me fired. But we were already fed up with this place and we just wanted to finish up and get out. Like, we wanted out of there ASAP. And some of the guys had already been complaining about feeling like they were being watched, or that someone had put their hands on them. I'd also felt someone tugging at my harness a few times, and when I would look behind me, no one was there. So I climbed down, and it was pitch black. This room must have been about 30 or 40 feet. My headlamp and flashlight did not seem to be giving me much light at all. It was super weird. I remember asking my co-worker to ask someone to run an extension cord and some lights, because I literally couldn't see anything unless it was a few feet away from me. He told me he'd be a few minutes, and I really did not want to be in there, so I told him that it was fine, and I was going to look around real quick to see if it was even worth the hassle. So when I'm walking around, I happened to see a shadow, like if someone was standing in the corner. So I started asking this person who he was and what he was doing there, but there was no response. I thought it was a hobo who had found his way in somehow and didn't get a response, so I walked closer, and it turned out to be a mannequin that someone had somehow put there. I remember that I had put it on the ground and continued to look around and found a spot that had some contaminants, and I let my co-worker know. I made the mistake of looking back where I had laid the mannequin down, and it had been moved from where it had been somehow. It was now several feet away from where I had originally laid it. I literally freaked the hell out, scurried up the rope, but we still had to get the contaminants out, and I and my co-worker had to get a ladder and another 2 guys to keep an eye on us while we went down there to remove said contaminants. I wasn't willing to go back there alone, and the guy who had hole watch refused to be left on top by himself. What ended up happening is that while we were removing the contaminants, the radio started going crazy. My co-worker and I almost fell off our ladders because we felt someone push us hard from our harness, and also these guys on top kept asking us what the hell we wanted over radio and to stop messing around, because they claimed they kept hearing us call them from the hole. The mannequin also moved again. So we were already pretty sketched out and wanted to get out. When we finished this job site ahead of schedule, we still had to go through inspection by a hygienist, and they asked to be accompanied by someone because they didn't want to go in alone. One of my bosses decided to accompany the dude because he also wanted to see the hullabaloo that had gotten us all excited. When they went down, he kept yelling at us over the radio to take things seriously, because he thought we were messing with them, because creepy crap kept happening, and they were inspecting every area that everyone had worked at. He knew that we took our job pretty serious. We had zero tolerance on horseplay at our job sites, mostly because the job was pretty dangerous. We did report to several government agencies, and a lot of the jobs we did were for the government or huge private businesses. At the end of the thing, he mentioned that he felt someone pull on his Tyvek hard enough to make a tear on it, and that the hygienist had heard people calling their name and had felt a hand. Basically, he said that they had gone through a gauntlet of crap. They also found the mannequin, and I guess that's when our boss lost his marbles and flipped out on us because he thought that we had put it there to mess with them. The strange thing about what he said was that it was standing in a corner where I had originally found it. There are a few other places I've been to that are pretty trippy. I think that school was the worst out of all of them. mostly because of the frequency of stuff that was going on, and how absolutely crazy we sounded when we would get together and talk about it at our safety briefs before and after we ended our day. The reports we wrote must have had our bosses and other people thinking we were nuts, because even though we would do atmospheric testing for gases and whatnot before we entered or went down, given the situation, everyone thought we must have suffered from some gas leak or something, even though they knew and had warned us it was maybe haunted. There were several crews there in charge of different areas, so about 15 to 20 of us in total, and we rotated 6 or 7 people out of the site because they didn't want to be there for obvious reasons. This happened to me and my friend around 9:30 p.m. on a Saturday. I live in an area where not much goes on and is pretty safe for the most part. Me and my friends are dumb teenagers, both males that love urban exploring. Our favorite sites to explore are tunnels. At 7:30 p.m. one night, me and my friend were exploring some sites around the park, 2 blocks away from our house, full of small tunnels to explore. We felt a little weird because we didn't feel as if we were alone. There were a couple of disc golfers, but we watched them leave, so at this point the park was completely empty. My friend and I were just exiting a small tunnel to get back to the park as we were waiting for the disc golfers to leave, so we could go to the next secret spot, which were train tracks that were still somewhat in use. To get to the train tracks, you have to go through an off path in the woods that has a few curves, so it was hard to see. My friend led the way. A few seconds later, I thought I had lost him, so I yelled his name. Here's where things got weird. I heard what seemed like an almost distant yell or shout from the train tracks. I thought he had sped up, so I jogged up ahead and eventually ran into my buddy. This was just around a curvy turn, so I asked him if he was okay, and he replied with yes, like nothing had happened. A little suspicion ran through my mind, so I asked him if he had yelled at me from the tracks and had come back to get me. Shockingly, he didn't. He was waiting for me just at the turn, and he also said he heard the yell. While my friends and I are idiots, instead of going back, we quietly continued to the tracks. When we got up to the bridge with the train tracks, there was absolutely no one and nothing up there. All I knew was that I felt like I was being watched from the trees or something. I let my friend know about this feeling, and we quickly stopped throwing rocks into the creek and headed back to the park. I knew something was wrong as we were leaving. I just couldn't put my finger on it. We played around on the basketball court at the park before we left. Due to the creepy vibe, my friend and I decided it was best to take the main road back instead of the shortcut through the woods that led to our neighborhood. It was around 9:30 now. My friend and I were talking about what we should do all night, because he was now spending the night. The park had a soccer field across the street from it, so it had 2 gravel parking lots that are sort of hidden by trees. As we were walking past one of the gravel lots, I felt what seemed to be like a warning from my body. I passed it off as nothing, but as we crossed the street from the gravel lot, here's where things start getting creepy. I could see someone come out the shadows of the gravel lot. They had appeared to be wearing very dark clothing and a hoodie covering their face. I was getting red flags everywhere. The way they came out of nowhere was so subtle and perfectly timed. It was almost as if they were waiting for us to cross to start following. My friend hadn't seemed to notice the strange figure, so I told him to jog ahead a little, and he seemed confused. So I pulled him close to me and told him what I had just seen. He seemed anxious, so he picked up the pace a little bit. Every once in a while I would look over my shoulder to see where he was, and every time I looked he would be at least 3 feet closer to us. I could hear the figure's eerie breathing. Thank God we were close to an alley shortcut that no one really used but me and my friends. To get to it, you had to go up a little hill left of the street. I saw this as an opportunity. I mumbled to my friend, "Use the alley." He quickly nodded yes, and the second we made it to the hill, we casually jogged up ahead to the alley. I told my friend to wait for a second, peeked over the street from the alley, and there I saw them. what appeared to be a man in his 30s making his way towards us very quickly. I could see his eyes now. They were staring directly at me with an evil and sinister look. I told my friend to bolt up the alley to his house, which was connected to the alley, and we'd never ran so fast. We made it up the street and took a sharp turn to the left. We lost him at this point, sprinted through his front door and locked every single entrance. We turned off all the lights and hid for what felt like an hour. Thank God he was nowhere to be seen. I've never seen this person again, and sincerely hope I never do. When I was 17 or so, I decided to become a novice urban explorer. I live in rural Minnesota, so there's no shortage of abandoned places to visit, if you know where to look. My boyfriend at the time lived in a tiny community just north of now-then Minnesota, which had a 2-story house that had long been abandoned for 10 years. The story was a tree fell on the side of the house during a storm, and the guy didn't want to pay for the repairs and just left. I spoke with my boyfriend about exploring the place, but since there was a convenience store right across the street, to evade detection, he pointed out we had to go at night. So we set our time to explore on Friday the 13th, 2013. The crew we had was me, my boyfriend, and 3 other guys. While my boyfriend and I were waiting for our friends, we got a call from them saying that the front wheel straight up spun off their car and they needed a ride. I'm not a particularly superstitious person, but it kind of seemed odd to me, seeing as the driver took really good care of his vehicle. Anyway, let's fast forward to the action. It was around about 10 p.m. and my boyfriend parked his car on a dirt road about a quarter mile away from the house. We really didn't want to get caught, and hiked in and decided to look in the backyard first. It was really overgrown, with waist-high prairie grass, and was generally uneventful, until we looked into the back window of the house. One of them seemed to go into a pantry, where there was still canned food on the shelf. The door to the pantry was open, and from there we could see a full set of living room furniture, couches and all. This kind of leaves me to disbelieve the whole "he left because of the tree falling" thing. It seemed like the guy who left there left in a hurry. Our original plan was to go in through the back door, but it was locked with some industrial grade stuff, so we went around the front of the house, which had a screen-enclosed porch. Thankfully it was unlocked, and we were able to look around the porch area. Knee-high stacks of Life magazines were absolutely everywhere, some of them dating as far back as the 80s, weather-worn and chewed through by animals. After fooling around for about 10 minutes, we decided to embark inside. Naturally, being a 17-year-old girl in a group of 19-year-old guys, I was elected as the one to open the door. But once I put my hand on the doorknob, I heard a noise on the other side of the solid oak door. 4 deliberate, rapid-fire knocks. Everyone booked the hell out of there faster than I've ever seen. We ran the entire way back to my boyfriend's car, but it wouldn't start. Everyone was afraid to go outside, and one of my friends kept claiming that he heard footsteps coming towards us. This was probably rubbish in hindsight. After a few long minutes, my boyfriend's car finally decided to start, and we punched it back to his house. Once we got back, everyone had their speculations about what the hell was on the other side of the door. My personal theory was there was a squatter inside that saw us snooping around and wanted to scare us away. I know that dilapidated houses can make weird noises, but the knocks we heard were very deliberate, not something a structural shift or animal could make. To this day, I have not visited the house again, or any other abandoned house in the area. So kids, if something seems like a bad idea, it probably is. And creepy squatter guy? Let's never meet again. Some friends and I were part of the Pennsylvania Ghost and Paranormal research team at one point. No one ever believes me because my ex lost everything, including the recorder in a house fire, which is creepy enough. We were in an old funeral home and didn't hear a damn thing the entire time until we went back to the recordings. There were sounds everywhere, old-style music playing and a woman, who was very close to my recorder, starting to hum really loud and then said, "We're here. Hi." We were absolutely scared crapless listening to the recordings. I had tears coming down my face. On the second floor of the house, we clearly heard a man's voice saying, "Don't," and that was it. I still wondered to this day what the hell it meant. We heard many doors slam that we didn't want to hear at the home while we were there. There was also much of that on the recorder. Strangely, we went through the basement where he would keep the bodies, and there was absolutely nothing but silence. There was a dead, half-eaten dog in the living room. Because we had so much evidence the first time, we went back a second time, and the property owner wouldn't let us back in because it was unsafe to walk anymore. They were about to do some renovations, then life happened and we never returned. Left the team and broke up with my ex and then the fire. I wish to go back and record one more time. It's a thing I keep thinking about. It's like a life calling, and that house just sitting there unoccupied waiting for me. I was walking with my cousins about 14 years ago when we find what looks to be an old burnt-out house. So naturally, being kids at the time and having no sense of self-preservation, we decide to explore it. Mostly it was just full of charred wooden crap and junk, but then one of my cousins found an entrance to a cellar outside. We busted the old rusted lock off the door and looked downside. It was dark down there, and we didn't really have any reason to go poking around it. Plus, we were starting to get creeped out, so we kicked some dirt down into it and walked off. When we get about 15 yards away from the house, one cousin says he hears a noise and we stop. And yep, there was a noise like someone coming up the rotting cellar stairs of the house. We peek back through the trees and see a dark kind of fuzzy shape crawl out the cellar which we left open. It looked like a big old dog. Then it stood upright. We hauled ass out of there and ran off in different directions like morons, each convinced that the cellar thing was chasing us. I ran right through some briars in a panic and tore my arm and legs up, which got me in trouble when I got home. We were all fine otherwise, but did avoid going back there in the woods in future. Closest thing I can figure is there was a small black bear living in the cellar. Maybe it had another entrance we didn't know about, and we woke it up. But seeing something hairy and dark come out the cellar then stand up was like being in a horror movie. I never want to go into that house again. Back in high school, around the end of my junior year, it became popular to go on these adventurous endeavors to haunted places. Literally a group of about 30 of us would carpool to some abandoned house one weekend, or to some secluded forest the next, spending the days at school in between searching for more places like these. Anyway, we had this cavalier nature about us when it came to potential hauntings. At some point, a friend of mine who was several years older than me told me about how he and his friends would do similar things when they were young. His childhood home backed up to a huge farm, and he and his friends would spend their days fishing or hanging out on this farm, so they were quite familiar with it. The owner, apparently a very religious man, a priest or pastor maybe, had owned the farm and a small house on the property. The story went that the owner had been locked up for murder and died in prison, leaving the farm to whoever, and it wasn't kept up. However, upon hearing the news of this man's demise, my friends told me that he and his friends had decided to go into the house. I guess the windows had been busted out, and they opened the door and walked in. He described them fooling around and trying to scare one another, but he had decided to walk up the stairs, and upon him reaching the second floor he saw a coffin in the main open room. The way he had explained it to me was that he didn't know what it was, and immediately sort of sauntered over to check it out, only to have the sudden flash of realization that this was a coffin in an abandoned house. I suppose he and his friends made a quick retreat from the house. Of course, he told this part of the story much better, prepping in more detail about the man who owned the property that gave the story that mythical, supernatural sort of feel. I remember being frightened by his delivery and sincerity, though it's quite likely he had rehearsed it for this type of occasion. This story had taken place 15 years or so previous to him telling me. I told one of my adventurous cohorts the story, and we thought it would be a good idea to investigate it. I knew where this person had lived, so we assumed we could simply walk behind his house, find the farm, then the house. We had a grand plan to bring the whole group out on the weekend, but we weren't sure if we were being strung up on a lie, or if this place was still there, if this were true. Anyhow, after football practice one weekday, he and I drove out to the street my friend lived on. There was definitely a farm behind his and his entire street's homes. We decided to go ahead and sneak into the yard and onto the farm to see if the house was there. Once we made it through the manicured suburban yard and through the brush separating the farm, we were knee-deep in overgrown field. We sort of hacked our way through a bit, and sure enough we made it to the edge of the hill the house was on, only 100 or so yards away. We had made it that far, so we decided to go to the edge to investigate. As we approached the house, there was a huge black bird perched on its roof. Once we were within 20 feet of the house, the bird flew away from the house and perched upon a tree adjacent to it. Being a bit nervous, I began to question why a bird had made such an odd move, but thought better of making a big deal out of it. Now this house is the prototypical haunted house. It had the quaint historic look with the broken windows, eerie shadows, and sort of ominous statues one associates with haunted houses. There was even a grave marker in the front yard, so again we were increasingly nervous as we approached. The door was jammed shut, but the window had been completely removed, so we played rock, paper, scissors for who would climb in first. I had the luxury of going second, but did so quickly, as being on the porch by myself was just as unsettling. The inside of the house had literally not been touched, besides weather damage. Almost everything was intact. There were pictures and decorations still up, with a bit of furniture remaining. We eventually became comfortable with being inside and began to snoop around. Of course, we were fearful of trekking upstairs, afraid to find something we didn't want to find. Alas, we squeamishly crept up the stairs only to find an empty space. At this point we became at ease with walking around the house, laughing off the ghost story mystique. As we looked through the main floor again, I noticed there was a tiny door in the kitchen. It was about knee-high. Undoubtedly, we flung it open, only to reveal a dark stone stairwell that a person would have to crawl down. Its presence alone was terrifying for some reason, but it had a landing about halfway down with stairs turning in different directions and out of our sight. However, perched on the landing, and partially concealed by the wall to the other part of the stairwell, was a large rectangular wooden box, a coffin. Now my friend and I weren't exactly small people, so I would imagine the sight of us pale-faced, with a cartoonish hair on neck, shocked expression trying to both squeeze out of a window at the same time would have been quite comical. Not to mention that both of us in a dead sprint heading away from this house through waist-high weeds. I still laugh thinking about both of us running like that. Anyhow, we turned to look back about halfway to the end of the farm, just to see the massive black bird fly back from the tree and onto the house. We probably made double time from that point on. A few years ago I worked with a real estate company as an inspector, which basically just meant I briskly walked in and around properties, snapping photos and checking that everything was okay. Unfortunately for me, I worked specifically with foreclosures, which meant I had to go into all the nasty houses that were messed up, spider-infested, broken into, or even recently abandoned and filled with people's stuff and dead rats. On any given day, I could drive as far as 2 hours away from my city to the houses. One day, I went to the country, in my neighboring state, Alabama. It was literally farmland, and I only had enough cell phone service to send a message. I went there for one house and absolutely hated it. It was a very old ranch-style house with a porch wrapping halfway around it, and was probably built in the early 1900s. It had 3 or 4 doors leading inside, although I could barely see them when I went in this day because whoever was in charge of keeping the plants in front of the house had abandoned this post for several weeks. The plants had grown so tall that you could barely see or even get onto the porch, and there were various wasps and bees all around. When I arrived, I groaned about the sight. I seriously should have gotten hazard pay for this sort of thing. I had already gotten stung by a wasp at a previous house a few weeks ago, and was not looking forward to unleashing a full can of spray onto this situation once again just to get inside. This house had no working locks on the doors, so all we had was a padlock on one door, and I had to retrieve the keys from a lockbox that was yet on another door. I ducked my way towards the lockbox while avoiding the wasps that made their home in the rotting porch roof. Sweating and anxious. Once I retrieved the key, I went back to the door with the padlock, and after about 5 times running back and forth, trying to avoid the wasps, I finally made it inside. I felt relief, but not too much. There were still random wasps inside because the doors weren't secure enough to keep them out. Most of the walls around me exposed their insulation, and there were dead flies everywhere. I snapped a series of photos and moved on to the kitchen and nearby bathroom. I tried to walk as quickly as I possibly could because I hated being inside there, but I was also concerned about not running through webs or coming upon any dead things, so I didn't go too fast. I snapped photos of appliances, disgusting floors, and views of the entire room, then moved on. About 2 more rooms in, I made it to the door of the second to last room. It had a fireplace to the right and a door leading outside. It also had a door next to the fireplace that led to the final room. Once I was finished there, I made my way to the last room of the house and totally froze. I stood in the doorframe and took a moment to examine the scene. In the last room was yet another door to the outside, and it was wide open. But that was only mildly alarming. I'd seen break-ins before, and even though it was alarming, I seldom ran into anyone, especially since it was broad daylight. But there was one thing out there, and it was truly bothering me. It was a backpack, a drink, and food sitting right next to the door inside the house. I was frozen with fear and anxiety, and quickly thought through what to do. I turned to my right, where I knew a closet was, a closet that held stairs to an attic. I quickly worried about if anyone could possibly be hiding up there. I wasn't entirely quiet this whole time, so I wasn't confident they'd be aware of my presence. In fact, if anyone was there. Then I focused back on the door. I stayed really quiet, hyper-aware of any sounds. I didn't hear anything, so I decided to quickly and quietly leave. I raised my camera and quickly took 2 or 3 photos of the door and the items, then turned and power-walked my way back through the house. I don't remember if I put the key back or not, but I know I definitely didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Once I reached outside, I ran to the car, quickly got in, locked the doors, breathed fast and heavy in a cold sweat, goosebumps tingling all over me, and left. All that ran through my mind was fear of what could have happened, and the fact that I was so far from anyone who could have helped, with no way to call the police, and it made me shiver. At any other property, I would have just called the cops to report the break-in, but I couldn't even do that. My boss didn't send me back for a few weeks. When she did, she told me the plant should have been cut by now and everything should be good. I asked if she knew anything about someone who was still there, and she acted like it wasn't a big deal. That annoyed me. She said that they had finally sent for someone to fix the door, and that it should be fine, but I was still being sent alone, so it wasn't much comfort. In the end, I never saw any more break-ins on that property, but still hated going there. The first time I went back, I carried a screwdriver with me in one hand the whole time. Ever since, I've always had a heightened fear of intruders or videos with squatters in buildings without people knowing. It sort of gave me a new phobia. Thank God I was lucky enough to not encounter anyone alone. Hey guys, Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you liked tonight's abandoned places and urban exploration stories. It's one I very much like doing. as I always have had an interest in exploring abandoned places. Not that I've ever really done it, but it does sound fascinating. Just adventuring into an old time capsule, sort of, to see what life was like for a specific bunch of people at a specific bunch of time. It does sound quite interesting. I can definitely resonate with some of the explorers in this. If you also enjoyed the video, feel free to let me know down below. And if you're new here and haven't subscribed, like the 73% who don't, feel free to join in and subscribe. Alright then guys, I'd like to extend a further thank you to my wonderful patrons and members whose names can be seen on screen. You guys are awesome, and your help really does mean the world to me. It helps keep the channel running. If you'd like your name on screen, you can definitely find out how by clicking a link in the description. But that's it for me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.